Hey, welcome back. Today we are going to talk about right and left, or left and right, and top, bottom, and bottom, top. That's the same, but bottom, top. Or said otherwise, we are going to talk about change. And why are we talking about that? This, of course, has everything to do with the reading direction. Because chances are big that your default reading direction might be left to right, like mine is as well. But there's quite a big group of people who reads in another direction. Big portion will be right to left, but there's even top to bottom or bottom to top. And that brings us to a rather interesting point in web development. And no, I'm actually not talking about looking at the direction attribute on your HTML node and adding custom clauses based on if it's left to right or right to left. That was how we had to solve it until now, which took quite some additional effort, resulting in people most of the time not doing it. So in today's video, I actually want to take a little bit of a deep dive into something new called logical properties. And with logical properties, we actually now have a pretty simple solution in making sure that your website works in all of the different reading directions, without you needing to add different styles based on every reading direction. And for that, we're actually going to have a look at this example that I created, where I created a very ugly looking newspaper-like page, or I mean, it doesn't even look like a newspaper, but okay, it serves the purpose. And what I actually want to show you today is what happens if you start using these logical properties. And we're going to create that logical property example together as the second example. And then we can change the reading direction and together have a look at how these different versions look like. Because if I change it from left to right to left right now, you already see that there's a few things that look a little bit weird. There's some overlapping here, there's a border that's on the wrong side, there's padding missing, all these different things. Because until now, to support these different reading directions, you had to implement both left and right to left twice. So, okay, back to logical properties. What is it about then? Well, I created a little diagram in this article where I actually compare the physical properties, top left, bottom right, with the logical properties. And what's actually going to change is the naming of these things. We're not talking about left and right anymore. We are talking about, as you can see here, if I zoom in a little bit, we're talking, for example, about block start and block end instead of top or bottom. And the horizontal axis is now called the inline axis, inline start and inline end. And that means you need to learn to use these new names. And yeah, that's annoying because change is hard, like I said in the beginning of this video, but it's for the better. Because if instead of using a width, you would use inline size, which is the new name for width, as soon as you switch from horizontal to vertical, it will use the width as the vertical value instead of the horizontal value. So the inline will simply switch around. So this way, you don't need to add any custom styles for reading direction changes at all by simply using the correct values. So today, I actually want to change this demo we have to use these new logical properties because they're not used a lot yet, but they bring so much value. And I think bringing more attention to it hopefully makes people use this more and more. I created a short list in this article as well, where you can see what the new namings will actually be. Where you can see that most of the time it simply adds these names as suffixes to the current existing properties. But there are a few nuances here and there. For example, the border top left radius is called border start radius because it's the start of the block and the start of the inline. It's that cross section. And the other thing is also, for example, for the width and height, it's called inline size or block size. And the same goes for min or max inline size or block size as well. And for left and right, you have to use inset inline start or inset inline end. So let's go back to our demo and start changing things around and see what kind of impact it has if we then change the writing mode. So let's take this example and let's make it full screen so we have enough room to work with, and change our reading direction back and also zoom out again. So looking at this example, you see that there's twice exactly the same content. And if we look at the code, you also see that there is an article as well as a header element, which is both the title as well as this card component. Then underneath there's exactly the same thing again, but it's wrapped inside a div with a class name logical, so we can add some custom styling for our logical component and use some specificity to override what's currently there. So that way we can use them both side by side and you can see the changes a little bit better. If we quickly hop over to our CSS file, you see that I have split things up a little bit. At the top, you actually find all of the different properties that we will be having a look at. There's all of the different physical properties that all of our elements have, as well as some physical properties with a media query as well. Then underneath there is some general styles to add, for example, the border, add some background colors, font sizes, things like that. And as well as some styles for the toggles at the bottom. But all of those can simply be ignored for this demo. We will only be focusing us on this top part, where we will be changing all these things like max width, margin, padding, all of those things. And what I want to do next is also add a wrapper div around our main item, which I've actually already gone ahead and did as well. So I've added a physical class name around our first title and card. So that way, if in a minute we go, for example, to our paper title, I can add a physical class name in front of it, and it will remove the lines from our logical element. Because otherwise we would need to reset border right to initial to prevent it from sticking around. So before we change anything, let's quickly change the reading direction again and see what happens. If we do that, you notice that there is a border on the left side, which actually, if we go back to left and right, it was in between the text and the image. And you also see that there's some padding around this line as well. But if we change the reading direction, suddenly the padding is also on the left side. On top of that, you also see that this like and share element is on the right side. But in a right to left reading direction, you actually read from right to left, so it should now be on the left side. But then the border radius is also in the wrong side. And the same goes for the border radius at the end of the card. That should also be on the left side now. So all these different things would be something that until now, if you just use left and right, you had to override based on the right to left attribute. However, if we now start using the logical properties, you see that everything adapts automatically. So let's first start with our main title, because what you see there as well is that there is a border on the right and on the bottom. And it should actually be on the bottom and on the left if you change reading directions from right to left. So let's add another class name here, a logical, and then paper title. And I'll put them right underneath each other so you can directly compare those two with each other. Instead of using border right, we're going to use border inline end and add the border on top of there. And look at that, the border appears on the left side. But if we now change reading directions, it goes to the right, which is exactly what we want, without needing to specify any additional borders. So for the bottom, we get border block end, which is also 1 pixel, and that adds it back. But if we would go into vertical mode, which probably messes everything up now, you notice that all of a sudden, and let me quickly add something to the title, the vertical daily, the logical daily, so we know which one to look at. Because if we do that now, you see that the line stays at the bottom, whereas for our physical properties, it would suddenly become the line at the top, which is not correct, of course. So that already fixes our main title component. Let's continue and have a look at, for example, the card component. First, let's add the physical class in front of it again. And then we're going to add another class named Logical for our card component. So the first thing we have to look at is the max width. If we change it to vertical mode, it doesn't really look like there's anything wrong. But let me change this to, for example, 100 pixels. And you notice that all of a sudden, well, pretty much the height of the card changes instead of what I would expect the width to be. So it's actually changing the wrong property. But if we would add max inline size 100 pixels, you notice that suddenly the width of the card is actually squished in. And that is what we consider the width of this element. So only using max width again would break something, but simply going for inline width solved everything. And then the next thing we have to change is the margin 0 auto. If we look at our non-physical properties, if we look at our physical properties version, we see that it isn't centered at all anymore. And that is because it's trying to center it on the x-axis. But we actually want to center it on the y-axis right now. So again, we need to use an inline property. In this case, we can, instead of using margin 0 auto, which will always use the physical properties, we can use margin inline auto. And that will set the inline property, so left and right, or if you change it to vertical, top and bottom, to the center. And if we go back to horizontal, you also see that in both versions, it is still centered. Next one is the border radius. So border bottom right will actually become border end radius. And that is because it's located on the cross section of the end of the block and the end of the inline, or the end of the inline and the end of the block. So looking at our right to left version, it is on the right side, but if we switch, it suddenly goes to the left. And if we go to the vertical mode, it will also always move around based on our left and right settings, which is really neat. And I think while looking at it, the vertical will always be really hard because the language we're right now looking at is English, but most of the time also the letters in that language will also be vertically instead of horizontally. So things will change a lot anyways. But by already using logical properties, at least you probably get there like 95% of the way. Plus, for the horizontal version, it simply will always look perfect. Even if someone would use, for example, Google Translate to translate the content of the page. So let's finally also add the padding, which will be padding inline, which is 1 rem, and padding block, which is 5 rem and 2 rem. And I have to use both of these values because I can't use the padding shorthand because that will use physical properties again. But this way, it will again add all of the right paddings, even if you go from left to right or right to left. The padding is still not fully perfect on desktop though, and that is because there's actually some media queries here as well that are also applied. So let's quickly change those two for the desktop version. The first one is physical. Then we need to add that for logical as well. And we get padding inline of 4 rem and padding block of 2 rem. Next, let's also change the share element, which I decided to position with position absolute instead of perhaps adding it to the grid, simply because I want to show you how position absolute works as well. So if we add the physical class name again, and then we're gonna copy it and add a logical class name as well for our share element. Then we're also gonna add position absolute, that will stay the same. And then we actually get inset inline end of 0 and inset block start of 0, which will move it to the right top in our regular reading mode. Then we can also add the padding of 1 rem, which will stay the same. And we're gonna add a border radius of bottom and start radius of 1 rem. And you already saw that I needed to think a little bit about where this is positioned, but that is because the bottom is a block end and left will be the inline start. So that converts into end start. And by doing that, both of them again look exactly the same. But if I change from right to left again, you suddenly see it moves to the left and the border radius is in the right position. I mean, I get really excited about this because simply by changing my work, everything will become way more accessible for other reading directions too, but there's nothing else I need to do for this anymore. So next is this padding for the content. Let's add physical class name in front of it. Then we go to logical content and we add padding block ends of 1.5 rem. And the same for the intro, physical, and then we're gonna change this to logical intro margin block start of 2 rem. Then finally, we're also gonna tweak this illustration. Let's add the physical class name again. And let's add our own custom logical. Padding top, we again have to change to padding block start of 1.5 rem. The margin top and margin bottom will be a margin block as a shorthand. So that's margin block auto, which is actually 1 line less than it would be on the regular physical properties. And finally, the border top will be a border block start. And that will add the border top. This border top though is again something that's actually only visible on mobile, because for desktop we are overriding them right here. So let's also change this illustration to contain the physical class name as well. And then we add logical illustration here too. And that means we need to reset those settings as well. So padding top again will be padding block start of 0. Padding left will be inline start of 3 rem. Border top will be border block start of none. And border left will be border inline start of 1 pixel. And then you already start to see that this line is now moving into the right position. The only thing lacking still is some padding. And that is because we still have one more media query to go. This content. We also add physical there. And then we create a new one with logical class name again, where we say padding and block end, which is the same as bottom of 0. And then padding inline end of 3 rem. And all of a sudden you see that the text now is correctly positioned, because compared to the one on top here, you see that everything is in totally the wrong position. But now with our logical properties, suddenly everything seems to be in the right place. And if we switch back to left to right, they're exactly the same. And if we go into vertical writing mode, well, the text is of course in the wrong direction, but all of the margins, the borders, the paddings, everything kind of makes a lot of sense. Also, if we go from right to left, top to bottom, also it starts to make a lot more sense. And again, I think the vertical mode is really hard to get right. And probably if you're building a website like that, you're mainly focusing on the vertical mode. But also for the horizontal mode, if you really learn yourself to write your code this way, there's nothing you need to do to make it accessible to people with other reading directions. So in my opinion, this really should start to become your default. And I'm personally also not yet using this in most of my projects. But if you look at this, There's literally no reason why you shouldn't start learning this new technique and start using it today. This will be the future where frontend will be heading to. And in a few years, if you're still using left, right, or width and height, I hope you will be one of the only ones, because it's just so important for inclusivity that things like this just work out of the box. And our browsers now give us the APIs to do it. So make use of it. As a final word, I also want to show you that I wrote everything in article form as well, with some more context and details here and there, figures to learn from, and also a mapping of all of the new properties. I also wrote a little bit about Tailwind because they're starting to add support for this as well, but they're mainly having support right now for the inline properties. However, again, I think if we start using it more and more, hopefully it will push all of those frameworks to also start supporting it, because this will be the future. Everyone will be using it, so you better start using it today. I really hope you learned something from this today and I inspired you to look for change and start improving yourself, instead of sticking with what you've learned maybe years ago already and just keep on doing that. I know change is hard. For me, going from Flexbox to start using CSS Grid a lot more was, for example, one of the things that I thought, Flexbox is working perfectly for me. Why would I start using CSS Grid if Flexbox also makes a lot of sense? But adopting these new technologies will often make your code a lot simpler, better, and in this case, a lot more accessible as well. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did so, leave a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel because there's way more content coming. And if you can't stop watching, definitely join the Pro membership, which is linked down in the description as well, because there will be a lot of extra content coming there soon as well. And it's still 99 euros. Thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you in the next video.